So pleased that we could get this venue. It is some of the most spectacular views in all of the Sydney. Can't hear, okay. Some of the more spectacular views in all of this city, and that's why we're facing forward rather than out the windows, but there will be some time at the end for you to go ahead and appreciate the views where we have some coffee and tea and things like that. So we're very pleased that we could get the venue. Now, it's being sponsored by IPPE, and that's that's the Institute of Positive Psychology and Education, and that's sort of our word map of what we are. We have a little brochure, flyer that has some advertisements that you might, just to give you a little bit of background about who the Institute is. That's our attempt to try and put everything onto one slide, which obviously doesn't work too well because you probably can't see it. But I guess some of the key issues are that we're a world-class multidisciplinary center in positive psychology and education, and our values are that we have fundamental concern for justice, equity, diversity, and dignity of human beings. We have a wide variety of different research programs: positive education, positive self and well-being, indigenous culture education and well-being, substantive methodological synergy, which probably fits into what we're looking at today, positive psychology and social development, mindfulness, compassion, and action, physical activity, sport, and health psychology, and positive organization and social climate. We're a major research institute, and all of our academics are research only, and so that there's lots of expectations that we're going to be doing lots of wonderful research and bringing in lots of good grants. And many of the people here are colleagues that we work with on our grants, some of our industry partners, and we feel really pleased that we're able to share this with you. Now, this is a slightly more personalized perspective of the Institute. I won't go into it in any detail, but how we came to be at ACU is a really interesting story. Slightly over a year ago, Christmas in 2013, we were the Center of Positive Psychology and Education, not the Institute, but the center at the University of Western Sydney. And just before Christmas, we were the very cooperative target of a friendly corporate takeover by the Australian Catholic University. In a matter of 6 weeks, several weeks before the census date for the research ranking process, all 55 people from our center, academic staff, students, in a period of 6 weeks negotiated new contracts and moved to ACU. The aim is to become, well, we're already a world leading institute, and that was why we that was why we were recruited, but we had a substantially expanded budget, academic staff, and a much broader scope of the sorts of things that we're looking at. We also were given facilities. We were also given financial assistance to go recruit who we thought the best people were in the whole world in our areas. And some of the people that we recruited, we are listed here. Rich Ryan, Ralph Schwartzer, Felicia Hubert, Lazarus Stankoff, Joseph, Bob Valorant, all of these people from different parts of the world who had an incredible pedigree and certainly brought much recognition with them. And so we're going from strength to strength. Now, let me go ahead and move on to the presentation today. Our keynote speaker is George Leckie. We first met when I was still at Oxford, and George, I guess, is the heir apparent of Harvey Goldstein's group at Bristol. He and Harvey worked together presenting multi-level workshops all over the world, and among other things, that center is probably the heartland of multi-level modeling, but also the whole issue of how you do value-added models. And so UK has probably some of the best data available anywhere in the world for doing value-added modeling, and at Bristol in particular, they probably have the strongest statisticians in terms of the best way of doing multi-level modeling. And so when George indicated that he was going to be in Sydney for a while and asked if we would be interested in having him give a presentation, I jumped at the chance because I realized that this is a really hot topic here. And I think it's probably fair to say that there's no right way to do value-added modeling, and the best, and even the best practice has some problems with it. And so George will introduce to us some of the problems that that UK has run into in trying to do this exercise, and at the same time at least give some hints as to some of the problems that we might run into here in Australia, where we're starting more and more to try and do this sort of this exercise. There's a bit of a blurb for George, so I won't go into that any further, and I won't take any more time, and I'll go ahead and hand it over to George. Thank you very much. You need that and that.
How's that?
You have to talk about that's just for the video.
Sorry?
It's just for the video.
Oh, okay, that's just for the video. Okay, right. Well, thank you very much, Herb, for that kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here today. More generally, it's great to be in Australia for me to learn about the Australian experience of national testing, and in particular the publishing of those data on websites, the My School website publication of NAPLAN data, because there's a lot of similarities with what we do in the UK, and part of the aim of this trip is for me to learn more about the Australian context, because I think both can learn a lot from one another. Having said that, this is kind of fairly towards the beginning of my trip to Australia, so this talk is, I'm afraid, purely UK orientated, but I think certainly in the discussion at the end, we can talk more about the similarities and differences between the two systems. Okay, so of course it's not just Australia and England. Many countries are increasingly doing national testing and publishing those data. Many different states within America, Hong Kong have also been doing school league tables effectively for quite a long time. But the UK has one of the longest histories of doing this. We started in the early 90s with publishing schools' exam results, and over time, more and more complex performance indicators have been published. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to review some of the headline performance measures that we've been publishing, talk about some of the issues we've run into, but then I'll shift over to focusing in some detail on something called expected progress, which is the headline way in the UK at the moment of trying to measure how effective institutions are. And I'll contrast that with something called the value-added approach, which has been is discussed a lot in the school effectiveness literature, has been used previously in England, but has kind of fallen out of favour somewhat at the moment, and I'll say why. And it's used, for example, in Hong Kong and in the States as well. Okay, but first, a bit of background, right? Because some of you are going to be fairly familiar with the UK system, and others not at all. Okay, so we have two phases of schooling, primary and secondary. Primary goes to age 11, year group 6, at which point all kids in the country change schools and move into their 5 years of compulsory secondary schooling. That takes them up to age 16, at which point they do their GCSE examinations. Okay, these will be in English and maths, which are compulsory, and which I'll focus on quite a bit in this talk, but also a basket of other subjects of their choosing. Then there's an optional further 2 years of education, A-levels, and then you might go on to university. Okay, so the crucial thing here is at the end of primary schooling and at the end of secondary schooling, we have national tests or examinations. So I mentioned those GCSE exams at age 16. At age 11, just when you're finishing primary schooling, you do national standardized tests in English and maths. And each child will receive a continuous point score for how they're doing in each subject. For what comes later, it's worth noting that these are often reported in levels. Okay, so just as you guys here with NAPLAN have a score, but you often talk about bands, which band you're in. So we have a point score and we talk about levels. Okay, and then your GCSE grades are ordinal, whilst of course there are continuous point scores beneath this. In terms of the data we analyse and have available, this is as fine-grained as it gets. Okay. So it's these two measures, your GCSE grades and your Key Stage 2 tests, which is the two variables really that I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this talk. So it should be simple, but a lot of difficulties come along the way when we want to use these data to say something about schools. Okay, so I'll soon show you some screenshots of our performance tables. But it's worth noting, why do we go about this exercise of trying to say something about the effectiveness of schools? Well, the argument given by the Department for Education in England was initially very much one about school choice. Okay, so in 1988, we had the biggest reform of education since the Second World War. A national curriculum was introduced, and with that, there was national testing. And part of this reform was also that for the first time, parents would be able to at least express a preference for which school their child would attend. Okay, so an element of parental school choice was introduced. And this was all these ideas of creating competition between schools, survival of the successful schools, the less desirable failing schools would close down, a free market in education, those kinds of ideas. But of course, if you're going to encourage the public to choose, you've got to provide some information to base that choice upon. And that information are the results from these national tests. Okay, so that was the original argument. The school accountability argument has at least in my opinion, increased over time. So these are publicly funded institutions. We should be holding them accountable for what they do. And so the results are there, published for that reason as well. And we're starting to see almost a formula for defining what an underperforming school is, okay, in the government's eyes, as a function of test scores. So this school accountability role is going up, really. The third argument, which is given, but it has less emphasis, at least in the UK, is a school improvement one. And this is, on my initial reading of the My School websites, this argument is talked about a lot more. It's slightly more constructive approach to publishing these data, which is to encourage schools to self-reflect on how they're doing, to find other schools in similar circumstances which are apparently doing more successfully, and try and identify, well, what are the policies and practices in those more successful schools, and can we import them into our school? Okay. Right. Everything I've said so far and everything that I'm going on to say is about schools, right? But what about teachers? Okay, a lot of the academic research shows that it's not so much the school you go to, it's the teacher that teaches you. Teachers are a very important source of influence on students' test scores. Well, the UK have never gone down the route of trying to measure teacher effectiveness or teacher quality. I suspect that they balk at the idea of taking on the teaching unions, who would fear that this was a slippery slope to performance-related pay and so on. Okay, but it's worth noting. Okay, so here's a blast from the past. This is a school performance table from 1994, on a rather old-fashioned HTML web page. And this is for Bristol. And the table started off pretty simple. I know you can't read the numbers, don't worry, but we've effectively got schools and columns, which are the performance indicators. And initially, a few variables were published. You jump forward 20 years, and we have a modern glossy web page. So this is our equivalent to My Schools, if you like. But note here, on this school performance table, Department for Education, we've got a whole range of tabs. On any given tab, we have a whole range of sub-tabs. On any given sub-tab, we have a table. There's an overwhelming array of variables now being published. You can download the data. Okay, and you'll see the spreadsheet has 3,000 rows. They're your 3,000 secondary schools and some 400 columns. Okay, 400 variables being published on each school. Okay, so we're kind of getting swamped by the data being published. So, you know, the ability to download data is kind of good and bad. You know, it allows people to analyze the data and critique what's going on, but of course data can get misused as well. So, you know, I was looking on the My School webpage for how can I download the data? I want to play around with it. And they appear much more protective of the data, worrying about some of the many misuses of these data which can happen. Okay, that's just scrolling down. Now, I should say these performance measures are clearly just one dimension of what's going on. Okay, it's a very exceptionally narrow view as to what schools do. Now, Ofsted is our schools inspectorate who physically go into schools and try and give a more holistic summary of the quality of the institution, how effective it is. But having said that, you know, if you read their reports, the actual test scores and the school performance table performances get discussed a lot. Okay, so they still play a very important part. Something else that Ofsted does is that they go much more visual in trying to make the rather dry data pumped out by the DFE more accessible to users. And that is something I liked about the My School website, was that it was very visual and a lot of effort had been made to try and make something rather complicated accessible to the users. So that's something which the DFE could learn about, I think. Okay, so moving on, what about the media? It's the media which has really kind of led to all this data being referred to as school league tables, because then this is the downside of making the data accessible. The media will take it, will cherry pick the indicators that they want to tell the public about. They will kind of rank schools, and you'll get rankings, and effectively schools are being named and shamed. And you get the top 100 schools, the worst 100 schools, all of this type of language, which might not be particularly constructive for school improvement. Okay. And another thing they do is they can distort the underlying information. So there have been instances where we have previously had performance indicators which the government published with a margin of error. Okay, so you see these confidence intervals on the My School website, for example. So what the media do is they republish the score and they throw away the margin of error. Okay, because, you know, what is this thing? It just takes up another column here, get rid of it. But that's a distortion of what the government initially tried to give out. So these are some of the kind of, and this is the Telegraph, which is a broadsheet newspaper in the UK, is meant to be, I should be careful here because I'm not sure which of the broadsheet newspapers did this. But certainly there are examples where the information gets distorted by quite reputable outlets. Okay, so that was a bit of a background to the UK context. What I'm now going to do is say a little bit about the headline performance measures that are currently being used. And here it's worth distinguishing between two main types. Okay, attainment performance measures and progress performance measures. Okay, and my focus in this talk is on secondary schooling, the 5-year period, ages 11 to 16. So an attainment performance measure is like a snapshot, a photograph at the finishing line. It simply says, well, what are the average exam results in each school? Okay. And that has its uses, yeah, because it says something about educational inequalities in a country. You could see particular bits of the country aren't doing very well, others are doing more strongly. Well, therefore, in this area, people are going to go on to university, and here they're not, and so on. But really, for the uses I mentioned, the justifications I mentioned before, school accountability, school choice, and school improvement, for all of those purposes, we're actually more interested in what the school has actually done to the pupils. Okay, the effectiveness or the quality of the institution, how it's raised the performance of its pupils over the 5 years. And here, what I'm saying is we're interested in the progress that children on average make in each school, or the growth or improvement. Okay, so progress measures explicitly take into account children's starting attainments, okay, to try and make fairer comparisons between schools. Okay, here there's no adjustment for the fact that schools serve different contexts. Okay. Okay, so what is the headline attainment measure? This is, since the early 90s, this has really always been the percentage of children getting 5 or more good grades in their age 16 GCSE exams. Okay, it's been tinkered a little bit with. 2002, a range of vocational qualifications were allowed to be included, okay, to try and make this a more inclusive measure, not just focusing on purely academic subjects. Of course, what happened? Well, the number of entries for GMVQs went up because they're considered easier qualifications by which to do well on the performance measure. Okay, that's one argument as to why that happened. Then in 2006, maybe in response to that, the government says that, well, hang on, 2 of these subjects have got to be English and maths, core academic subjects. So that's kind of trying to pull it back in, make it more of an academic qualification again. So I guess the point here is that however you just design a performance indicator, it's going to create incentives. And if you're in a high-stakes system where your performance on these measures really matters, schools are going to respond. Okay, so, and they're not always going to respond in ways that you can imagine in advance. Okay, so perverse incentives is something that will come up again in this talk. Okay, what about the headline progress measure? Okay, measure of growth or improvement. Okay, previously we had value-added measures, and I'll come back to that. But currently we have something called expected progress. And let me show you a visual. Okay, this is from the government. Okay, this is how it works. You have at age 11 your key stage 2 level, like your band, right, where you're performing. Okay, with level 6 being doing very well at age 11 in English, for example. Level 1 rather poorly. And then some 5 years later, you have your GCSE grade. And what you want to do is you want to get into the pink zone. Okay, so the typical child at age 11 is operating at level 4. Okay, so for this child to make what is referred to as expected progress, they need to get a C grade or higher. Okay, kids doing better at age 11, level 5, well, they've got to get a B grade or higher. Whilst the level 3s, they only need to get a D or higher. Okay, so it's in this sense that expected progress, this measure, is a progress measure because it is taking into account your starting attainment. Okay, the better you're doing at age 11, the higher your target GCSE grade. So every child knows in advance what they need to get in order to make expected progress. And then what is at the school level, what do we have? Well, we just have the proportion of children in the pink zone. Okay, that's it. So you might ask, right, I understand the pink and the blue, what about the yellow? The yellow is missing data. Okay, that's not a methodological thing that I'm going to talk about today, except to say that it is important. Okay, and for example, you go to an inner city area, a very high proportion of children have missing data, typically because there's a high proportion of immigrants and they haven't taken one or the other of the test scores. So you're kind of ignoring huge chunks of the pupil population in these kind of inner city schools. Okay, but that's another criticism of how we go about trying to measure school quality. Okay, so that's the expected progress measure. And just to show you that it's high stakes, along with the 5 A-star to C measure, both of them feed into an equation by which the government defines a school as underperforming. Okay? And it goes like this. A school is underperforming if less than 40% of children get 5 A star to C grades at GCSE. Okay? Very low attainment. But there's an escape clause, which is where expected progress comes in. Okay? Because hang on, if despite the very low attainment in your school, those pupils improved an awful lot to get to that point, then the school must be doing something right, and we'll let them off. Okay? So this kind of underperforming judgments are a function of these two things. 5 A star to C, but you have a balancing role played by expected progress. Now, currently some 5% of schools are judged underperforming, and they'll get increased scrutiny from the school's inspectorate system. There'll be encouragement for those schools to be taken over by local successful schools, closure, and so on. Okay, so it's high stakes, is my point here. Okay, so I've introduced expected progress. I'm now going to say 3 reasons why this is not a great performance indicator. Okay. Okay, so first I've taken that table which you saw previously, the multicolored one, and I've just put 1s in the pink zone and 0s in the blue zones, because that's effectively what we have. These are binary judgments. You're either successful or you're not. It's a threshold type approach. Okay. And actually this isn't a kind of, this is not an ad hoc type approach. This is a methodology which has been used in other places. It's used in the States, in some states as well. And it's called a value table or transition matrix type methodology. So the first problem is that, this binary thing, it's not great, right? Because if you're a typical child at age 11 getting a level 4, your target grade is a C. But what about if you get a B or an A? There's no additional reward. There's no additional incentive for the school to kind of get you up to these higher grades. Likewise, if you just miss out, there's no partial reward for nearly getting to the threshold. Okay? So, in general, threshold performance measures, in a high-stakes decision, where a high-stakes system where schools respond to incentives, schools are going to focus on the borderline pupils. Okay? If you want to do well, concentrate your efforts on the kids just below the threshold and get them over. Okay, this is a pretty new measure, 2011, but 5 A star to C is also threshold, right? If you get 5 Cs or better, brilliant. If you get 4 Cs and a D, terrible. Okay, so there is evidence that schools get all the kids who are borderline, put them in the same classroom, get the best teacher in the school, and coach them to get them over the hurdle. But the problem is the high achievers end up coasting and not getting the attention they need, and other kids who are not going to get up to that threshold don't get the resources either. Okay, so it's a little bit ironic that some 20 years later a new performance measure comes along suffering from that same problem that 5 A star to C has also always suffered from. Okay, so that's just saying in words what I just said, describing this table. Okay, the second criticism is that there appears to be a very strong relationship between expected progress and prior attainment. Okay, so expected progress is reported, I should say, separately for English and separately for maths. Okay, and no other subjects come into this. And children at age 11, 95% of children are levels 3, 4, or 5. Well, if we look nationally at the level 5s, 79% of those get into the pink zone and make expected progress. We look at the low attainers, the level 3s, only 57% of those get into the pink zone. Okay, so remember, your level 5s have to get a B grade or higher, your level 4s have to get a C grade or higher, and your level 3s have to get a D grade or higher. Okay, so they set different targets, but they also have different probabilities of making their respective targets. So, and that's the national picture. So if you're a school and nearly all of your children are level 5s, you're sitting pretty. Okay, because you don't need to do so much to them, because nationally those kids have a high probability of doing well on this measure, the way it's designed. But if you're another school serving a disadvantaged community or the children are low attainers, the probability is much lower that they get into the pink zone nationally. Okay, so things are kind of rather stacked against you if you're a school with lots of low prior attainers by this measure. Okay. Now, in general, that doesn't seem that desirable. We want some kind of measure, some measure of school performance which isn't, directly influenced by its inputs, in a sense. We're kind of interested in what happens in the 5 years. Okay, what do schools actually do to their pupils? Okay, so this measure is kind of partially measuring the quality of the institution, but it's also partially measuring the inputs. Okay. So it's not really disentangled, those two things, inputs and processes. Okay, it's kind of a partial attempt, if you like. So another way of saying this is, well, this B grade, maybe these guys, we say, hang on, you should be getting an A or higher. Let's stretch them. Let's challenge them a bit more. And this probability would come down. Here, these guys, where we say you should get a D or higher, maybe we say, well, okay, an E or higher is acceptable, and that would go up. Okay, so I'm not saying what the correct decision is, but obviously different choices as to where you place zeros and ones lead to different performance indicators with different incentives and different characteristics. Okay. And this is how, actually, in America, where they've used this is how it works. There are proper discussions between policymakers, schools, school systems, as to, how do you value these different transitions? Is a level 4 to a C better than a level 5 to a B? And you can place different values on here through discussion and design a system which will have incentives, but they might have incentives which actually work for you rather than being perverse. Okay. But that's not how it's been implemented in England. It's just been implemented just like that. Okay, so it turns out, and again, this is just saying in words, summarizing what I've just described. It turns out that it gets a little bit more unpleasant, because here I've repeated this simple graph here, but I've changed the x-axis from your attainment level at age 11, 3, 4, or 5, to the underlying score. Okay? Because this is very coarse. 50% of children are level 4s, and we're not distinguishing between them. There's a huge range of ability in here. Okay, but they're just lumped all together. So we repeat the graph with the underlying score 0 to 36. And so 18 to 24 is the level 3s, 24 to 30 are the level 4s, 30 to 36 are the level 5s. Okay. And it's a scatter plot, but the size of the bubbles is just related to the number of children in that combination. But the thing to note here is, well, we still see the gradient, right, as you'd expect. But now we've revealed sharp discontinuities. Okay. So what this means is, around 24, take two kids, one 23.9 and another who's 24.1. Almost the same prior attainment, but they lie on either side of this threshold. One is a level 3 child, a top level 3, another one's a bottom level 4. The first kid is told to get a D or higher. The second kid is told to get a C or higher. These are otherwise identical children set quite different targets. That doesn't seem particularly desirable. And in what we see is a 30 percentage point discontinuity in success here. Okay. So again, there are incentives to kind of recruit high prior attainers. Once you have a cohort of pupils, let's concentrate on your low-hanging fruit, make sure these guys are successful before we turn attention to the harder-to-reach children, and so on. Okay. So in general, we don't want the systematic relationship between the performance measure and the inputs. Again, in words, what I said here. The third criticism is one about statistical uncertainty, which is we're taking these rather small samples of data. Okay, the typical secondary school has 180 pupils, and we're trying to infer from that something about the underlying quality of the institution. Again, this is just okay, schools serve different communities, but it's just a random sample of pupils. On another instance or in another year, you would have another random sample, be slightly different, slightly better, slightly worse, but there's noise. Okay. The government make no attempt to quantify that on 5A star to C or expected progress. Okay, so that's a kind of a big contrast to the My School website, where there's a lot of effort to put in margins of error. Now, people may or may not understand what a margin of error is, okay, but at least there's an attempt to kind of put that information in. So take a school, because these are percentages, right? So take a typical school with 180 pupils, where 70% make expected progress, that's the national average. The 95% confidence interval ranges 63 to 77. Okay, plus or minus 7 percentage point margin of error. So these are noisy statistics. Okay, so the problem is, by not communicating that, if a user sees two schools that differ by 5 percentage points, they kind of treat that as being more informative than it truly is. Okay, it might be a genuine difference in quality, but it could also be chance variation, luck of the draw. Okay, the better school just had a slightly better sample that year than the other one. Okay. Right, how are we doing? Value added. Okay, so I've gone through 5A star to C, the headline attainment measure, the photograph of the finishing line, if you like, and I've talked about expected progress, an attempt to measure the effectiveness of institutions. Okay, now value added is what I'll go on to now, and is an alternative to expected progress. Okay, but it's a methodology that we can use to get around some of those problems. Now, I should say in advance, I'm not suggesting that this is by any means perfect. There are clearly so many issues, both statistical and more general, with trying to measure schools' performances and use them to make these high-stakes decisions. But it's an alternative methodology that will kind of further illustrate the disadvantages of expected progress. Okay. So here's, I'm kind of half substantive, half statistician, so I've got to get a little bit of algebra in here. Okay, but not much. Okay, so this GCSE, remember, we're always working with these two things, the GCSE grade and the Key Stage 2 score. So we call this Y and X. Okay, and then we have subscripts IJ, because we have child I and school J. Okay. And like we want to keep things similar to expected progress to try and make this a fairer comparison. So like the government, I'll use their same point score system, which they assign 10 to an A star, 9 to an A, 8 to B, and so on. And I'm going to use, however, the underlying continuous Key Stage 2 score rather than those rather coarse levels. Okay, contains more information. And I use the same sample of pupils. Okay, so here's an equation, right? Okay, so this is the simplest multi-level value-added model. Okay, and I should say value-added analyses don't need to use a multi-level modeling approach. Okay, that's popular in education research, but economists would go down a school fixed effects approach, and there are other ways of doing this. Okay, but this is very popular and has been used a lot. It's a glorified linear regression. Okay, if you've done multiple regression, then there's regression of Y and X, and then there's something funny going on here. Okay, but effectively we're adjusting the GCSE scores for Key Stage 2 scores. We're adjusting for the input here. And then we're left with some unexplained variation. We can't perfectly predict why some kids do better than others. And that gets decomposed into a school effect, the thing of interest, and a bit left over. Okay, so the UJ is measuring here how many grades better the children do than predicted by their Key Stage 2 scores in school J. So if UJ takes a value 1, then children in that school are doing 1 grade better than you would have thought, given their characteristics. So the metric's easy enough. How many grades better than expected? 1, 2, 1.5, minus 0.7, you're doing worse, and so on. Okay? Some people love equations and other people hate them, but hopefully that's not too bad. Okay. Now the problem is that once you start kind of adjusting for the attainment of the child, you start to notice something else, which is if we put another variable into our model, the average attainment of the children, okay, you notice something here, which is this has an additional positive effect, typically, on the GCSE performance. So what this is saying is that if you take a child and you put them in one school, everyone's high attaining, or you put them in another, everyone's low attaining, they do better over here where everyone's high attaining. Okay, it's saying that over and above your own characteristics, you're affected by your peer group. Okay. Now this interpretation is the one that educational researchers go for. Okay. And then we start to think, well, now that we found this, do we want to adjust for this or not? Okay, so the literature argues that for holding schools accountable, you do want to adjust for this. You want to remove it from the school effect. Why? Well, it's a function of the inputs. And a school shouldn't be held accountable for its inputs, for the characteristics of the children when they turn up on day one. It's outside their responsibility. So on that argument, we should include that in the model. Unfortunately, that's just one reason why we kind of publish measures of school performance. Another is school choice. But if you think about it, a parent choosing a school, they don't care so much why their child's doing better in one school than another. They just want to know how much better will my child do here or here or here. Okay, why is a kind of a second order question. So for school choice purposes, you would argue the opposite. Well, we shouldn't adjust for that. And by not adjusting for it, it will stay in here, the measure which is reported. So we now hit the situation where one set of numbers isn't going to serve these different purposes. For holding schools accountable, or for choosing a school, or for school improvement, we kind of need different numbers for different purposes. That's what this is kind of revealing. And all of these issues I'm saying about value-added models are not specific to value-added models. It's just this kind of framework. A lot of research has been done on it, so we know the kinds of issues which come up, and it's quite easy to draw attention to them. If you work in something a little bit more specialized, like expected progress, or maybe even the similar schools methodology, where there's far less instances of it being applied, maybe some of the disadvantages aren't immediately apparent and only become apparent down the line. So there's something to be said for using a methodology which is very heavily used around the world, not just for value added. Okay. Maybe I'm now going to say this isn't a peer group effect. Okay. Because that's what an educational researcher would say. I started off in economics, so I kind of know what the economists kind of say about these things, and they would say something entirely different. They would say this is a selection effect. Okay. What they would say is, for example, very high quality teachers, they can apply for a job anywhere and go anywhere they like, for example. Well, like anyone else, if you can live in a kind of more desirable neighborhood, you probably would. Okay, so they go and get jobs in more desirable neighborhoods, where there's more wealth, higher SES, higher prior attainment. So there's a correlation between the quality of the teachers and the prior attainment, the average prior attainment of students. Schools which serve very advantaged communities tend to have better teachers and higher resources. This is how the argument goes. So that means there's a correlation between things like teacher quality, which are in here, and the average prior attainment of the students. Okay. Now, in not just multi-level models, any regression models, they always assume these two things are unrelated. And I've just said that they're related. Okay, so that's kind of a fundamental breakdown of the assumptions of this approach. And I've said a positive correlation. Higher teacher quality is found where you have higher prior attainment and vice versa. What happens is you kind of overestimate this and underestimate this, and you get biases. Okay. So an economist would argue that you should go down a kind of a school fixed effects approach and not a multi-level modeling approach. In reality, we have both peer group effects and selection effects. Conceptually, we can think of them both happening at the same time. They're very hard to disentangle. Okay. So the extent of the biases which might result if you kind of fail to model one or the other depend on their relative importance, which we don't observe. Okay. So it's basically just very tricky to kind of go about measuring value added. Okay. Now, going forwards with this talk, I'm going to discount the selection argument. But remember, it's there, but I'm not going to talk about it more. I'm just going to go with the peer group effects argument. I'm going to keep it in, because I'm going to put my school accountability hat on and say that that's what I'm interested in. not school choice where we shouldn't include it. That's how the literature argues it. Okay, right. Don't worry about the equation, except to note that this is very simplistic, right? Because we're saying there's a linear relationship between your Key Stage 2 score and your GCSE grade. As this goes up by 1, that goes up by beta 1. Okay, so in reality, if you look at the data and you analyze it, you put in quadratic terms, cubics, and so on. Okay, that's all that's saying there. I've just done something a bit more realistic given what the scatter plot of y against x looks like and the curve relationships you see. Okay. Right. This is what we wanted to see. Okay, so go back to expected progress. Rather unpleasant graph we saw previously. We didn't like the strong positive association, okay, because it meant that the measure was stacked in favor of schools with high prior attainment. And we didn't like the large discontinuities. Made no sense that two otherwise identical kids would be set different targets, have very different probabilities of making success. It's not really great, you know, if you for that kid there on 23.9. So having done this kind of value-added approach, we end up with this graph where there is no kind of overall upwards relationship and no discontinuity. So we've removed those two